It's always a great privilege to have in-house speakers who represent their departments very well. And without further ado, I will introduce Ms. Ramona Harris, our LPOR rep from 1555 Poydras, and to follow her will be Ms. Veronica Chanot, our HR director.
Thank you, Tommy. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the afternoon presentation for our safety meeting. My name is Ramona Harris. I'm the director of the Louisiana Protective Order Registry, and I usually live and work over at 1555 Poydras, and that's where most of my staff is right now, watching by live stream. And I just want to say hello to everybody at 1555. Thanks for tuning in. So this afternoon, we're going to be talking about domestic violence. We're all affected by domestic violence in some shape or form. We know someone, be it our family, friends, another relative, someone in our faith community, someone that we've gone to school with, who has been affected by domestic violence. So domestic violence occurs between current or former intimate partners. They can be adults or adolescents, between people of all racial, educational, social, religious backgrounds. They can be heterosexual as well as same-sex relationships, people who live together or live separately, married or unmarried, those in short-term relationships as well as those in long-term relationships. So why are we still talking about domestic violence today? Well, we're still talking about it today because it's still happening. It's still very prevalent in our community, and as much as we have this 24-hour news cycle that we live in, we're constantly hearing about domestic violence. It has touched every arena, the sports arena. We've been hearing some things recently in the news from the NFL, the soccer league, NASCAR, and even in popular culture. There have been some very high-profile cases from actors and entertainers, and there have been some very high-profile victims of domestic violence. So we see this, so this is why we have to engage in this conversation, because it's still happening today. In the United States, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will experience severe violence at the hands of a partner in their lifetime. And that's a high statistic. Women experience higher rates of intimate partner sexual violence and stalking. And also, women sustain more severe and frequent injuries as a result of the abuse. Louisiana, the great state of Louisiana, we rank in the top 10 states for female homicides committed by men. And over 3/4 of those homicides committed are perpetrated by a current or former intimate partner. And that's a very high statistic. So what is domestic violence? Domestic violence is a pattern, meaning that it's systematic. It's a pattern of behaviors directed toward a family or a household member. We often hear about physical and sexual abuse when we think about domestic violence, but there are also other forms of violence. Sexual abuse and physical abuse, those are the most common that we hear about, but there are other forms of abuse. Some of them being threats, intimidation, coercion, verbal abuse, emotional and psychological abuse. You know, why did you make me do it? Why do you make me act this way? Using children in a relationship to abuse. Isolation, a person might be isolated from family, from friends, and in some cases, the outside world. Economic abuse, when the family funds are withheld or a person does not have access to the household funds. And a lot of times when we think about economic abuse, we think about households where funds and resources are limited. But there's also a problem in high-earning households where there's a high income in the household because a person may be, say, a stay-at-home mom or a person who is not working, and they do not have access to the resources. Stalking, pursuing or harassing a person in a threatening manner. We also, in the information age that we live in now, cyber stalking is a main problem. And that's using electronic communication to harass or threaten through texting, email, social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Although there are other forms of abuse other than physical and sexual, each of them can be as damaging as physical abuse. The pattern that really defines domestic violence in relationships is that the abuse and the abusive tactics are used over time, repeatedly. And they often graduate in severity and in frequency. It may start off with just a push or a shove, and then it may end up where the victim needs to seek medical attention to address the injuries. And these tactics are most often used by men rather than by women, but we do know that there are men who are in battering relationships. The purpose that really defines domestic violence is power and control. That's the crux of the matter. These tactics are used to exert power and control over the other partner. So there are some other questions that usually come to mind whenever we're talking about domestic violence. People often want to know, why don't they just leave? Why do they stay? And why do they go back? And oftentimes people may go back over and over again. So in order to really look at this information, we have to understand the plight of the victim. Most people in relationships, you go into relationships in a very positive way. So there's love, there's hope for change. You don't go into a relationship thinking that it's going to end. So out of love, a person may stay. Obligation to the family. They may not want to separate their children. They may not want their children to grow up in a single-parent home. Obligation to the faith community. And then economic resources. In many cases, the victim may not have a job or money or transportation, or they may not have access to those things. Fear is another reason. Fear of consequences of what will happen. And also low self-esteem, which is a repeated effect of repeated intimidation. And also the person may have no place to go. We're all good people here this afternoon, and I don't want you to raise your hand, but how many of you would be willing to take in a victim who has maybe 2, 3, 4 kids and no resources? And even if you did take that family in, how long would you be willing to sustain that? How long would you be willing to do that? So there are some reasons that we look at for reasons that people might stay in a relationship longer than we feel that they should. Leaving is dangerous. The most dangerous time for a victim in an abusive relationship is at the point of leaving, because the abuser has exercised power and control, And if the victim is no longer there, if the victim is no longer a part of that equation, that power and control goes away. And oftentimes, they will not let that happen. And so that's why we have to talk about subjects like domestic violence in a setting such as this, the workplace, because this situation can spill over into the workplace. Leaving is hard to do, especially if you don't have the resources to do it. And also, leaving may not make the victim safer. As I alluded to before, when the person is seeking legal remedies, seeking safety, it may not be the safest time for that victim. So there are some reasons why people stay longer than we feel that they should, and there may be reasons why people, once they leave, they go back. Because it's a process. Ending any kind of relationship is a process. So leaving an abusive relationship, it takes time, and it can also be a very long and a very difficult process. So in order to understand victims, we have to first understand that staying or going back is not really the problem. The problem is abuse. Abuse is the problem. So some better questions for us to ask is, why does the abuser use violence? Why should the victim have to leave home? Abusers and how they operate, they often limit their abuse within the home, in private. No one knows what's going on. They may feel entitled to use violence because they've used this tactic to get their way. And it's worked over time for them. Also, abusers can be good at manipulation. Of course, they've manipulated the victim. They can also manipulate law enforcement, just talk their way out of it. Officer, we're just having a disagreement, everything is okay. They manipulate the court system sometimes. And also the counseling process. So for that reason, we do not recommend that victims go into counseling with their abuser. Because if a person is exercising power and control, that's not a healthy place for a victim to be. An abuser may be remorseful, but continue to abuse. There's often a honeymoon phase after abuse occurs, where everything is fine, they patch up, but then the abuse continues. Domestic violence is not caused by drugs, alcohol, or mental illness. Although these things can exacerbate the violence, it's not the root cause of domestic violence. Domestic violence is an issue of power and control. And often abusers are not held accountable for their actions. Because no one knows what's happening. It's done in secrecy. People tend to look the other way. We don't want to get involved, so we don't say anything. People often see it as a private family matter. And also fear of reprisal. You know, I don't want to get involved because I might be affected in this way or the other. And also people just don't know what to do. So that's why we're offering you resources today, so we can look at some of these things and know how to spot the red flags of abuse. We have a handout for you. And we also have a handout with some resources, numbers that you can refer to persons who may be in an abusive relationship. Louisiana responds to domestic violence in several ways. First of all, we have victim services programs, which are formerly known as battered women's shelters. They provide housing on a temporary, short-term, and they can also help a person with long-term housing. Child care. And work readiness. Because oftentimes people need to be trained to be able to sustain on their own. There are also court-monitored domestic abuse intervention programs, which are called batterer intervention programs, and these are programs that are specific to abusers. And we recommend that abusers go through this type of training rather than any kind of family counseling that they may be in proximity to the victim. We have specialized domestic violence units in our courts, in our clerk's offices, in law enforcement, our prosecution units, and specialized DV courts. They assist the victims in filing a petition and getting a temporary restraining order, and also preparing them for court for the hearing so that they could get a protective order. We also provide specialized DV training to law enforcement, the Department of Children and Family Services, prosecutors, and the judiciary. My department, the Louisiana Protective Order Registry, we have 2 training tracks. We have a regional training for attorneys and advocates and those who have a need to know and those who serve victims. And we also have a training specific to judges, the Judicial Education Project, which is a 12.5 CLE accredited course. In Louisiana, we have 12 statutes that provide avenues of court-ordered protection to victims. And in the past legislative session, I believe there were about 5 new domestic violence pieces of legislation that passed. Louisiana now has a firearms prohibition in the law that works in conjunction with the federal prohibition. We've had the federal for a while, so this will be totally new to Louisiana in having our own firearms prohibition. The Protective Order Registry, my department, I have a dynamic data production staff who, we're the statewide registry of these orders of protection that deal with domestic and dating violence. And I have a staff who receives these orders, and we get them entered into the registry. We make them available to be accessed by the courts and by law enforcement. We also transmit data up to the federal databases, and a lot of these orders can be accessed nationwide. So the Protective Order Registry is the court's response to the community as it relates to domestic violence. And now, Ms. Veronica Chanot will talk to us about the human resources response to domestic violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramona. Good afternoon, everybody. My role today, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about from the court's perspective as an employer, being that a lot of times these issues can spill over into the workplace if we find ourselves needing to assist an employee that is in a situation dealing with domestic violence. How do we handle that? So that's some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. We do have a court policy on domestic violence that was developed some years ago, and I learned earlier that some people don't know that we have such a policy, so we will disseminate that after this session and get it out to everybody, and also post it on our public drive so that you can have it at any time, and nobody has to know that you're accessing it. If you have some questions or things that you want to look up, the policy is always available to you. So I'll talk a little bit about what's some of the content in the policy without going through the whole 11-page policy, but I'll highlight some of the info that's in the policy. This being, of course, a reality in our society, we know that it can affect employees at work. Although we talk about leaving our problems at the door when we come into work, we're all human. And so certainly if we're dealing with something as serious as this outside of work, it can certainly spill into how we perform or how we interact with our coworkers at work. So the court adopted this policy to try to address some of those concerns and try to help us if we ever have to assist an employee in this situation. So the policy talks about ensuring the safety of our employees and really committing to a level of confidentiality. If we have an employee that comes to us with this issue, we would try very, very hard to make sure that we keep that information as confidential as possible and only involve people that are able to assist that employee, probably the supervisor, human resources, security. That team within those 3 departments should be able to offer some of the resources that Ramona referred to and talked about. So we want to keep this, for the employee's sake, as confidential as possible and be able to offer assistance to them. And speaking about authority and autonomy on an adult victim, you know, one of the things that's so hard for anybody to do is to come forward and say that they're having this issue. So one of the things that we commit as an employer is that we are not here to, one, sit in judgment of that employee and, you know, judge their decisions. Well, you know, why are you still with that person? As Ramona said, it can be very difficult to get out of that type of situation. So that is not the role that we take of judging that employee or dictating to them what they should do just because they have come forward to, you know, disclose that they're having this issue. So always keep that in mind if an employee comes to you seeking assistance. Again, just reiterating, one of the hardest things for somebody to do is to tell us. But there may be warning signs that you notice that may be an indication that an employee is going through something like this. Ideally, we would hope that an employee that's dealing with that issue would come forward if they need some assistance, but if they don't, then these may be some of, and this is not all inclusive, there may be other signs, but this is some of the things that we can kind of look out for and kind of, you know, wonder if maybe that person is having some issues outside of work. Receipt of frequent personal phone calls that seem to upset that employee, you know, as they're receiving these calls and hanging up from those calls, they get upset, or you see them crying. They're jumpy or on edge every time, you know, their phone rings, even before they pick it up, because they're afraid that every time their phone rings, it's that person. Changes or decline in an employee's work performance. A lot of times we have a star performer who all of a sudden you start to see, you know, changes in their work behavior and their level of performance at work. That could be a sign that, you know, there's certainly we have other personal problems, but it certainly could be a sign that there's a domestic issue going on at home. Attendance issues that weren't a problem before, and again, from a performance standpoint, you start to see that, whether it's, you know, missing whole days or tardiness. Frequently, that could be an indication as well. Somebody who used to be very friendly and outgoing starts to distance themselves from their coworkers and doesn't really talk a whole lot anymore, doesn't chit-chat much on a friendly basis, doesn't participate in social things that you used to do in the office, whereas before they were always involved in those types of things. So these may be some of the things that you know, we can look for, seeming like depressed or, you know, that they just kind of have this despondent outlook. And the most obvious sign, I think, of course, would be visible bruises, which, you know, when you have abusers who are manipulative, then you may not see often signs of visible physical abuse. So, but if you do bruises, you see an employee that's showing up with frequent bruises and always explaining them away, that could be an issue that that person is going through something. The way that we want to respond to an employee, you know, once we do know there's an issue, whether you're a coworker or a supervisor of that employee, we always want to be as sensitive as we can be and respond with some empathy and understanding to try to assist that employee as much as we can. So some of the things that we, you know, commit to in our policy that we'll work with the employee on is creating a workplace safety plan for the employee, referring them to appropriate resources, some of the folks that Ramona talked about that are included in the handouts, addressing employee performance concerns, trying to help that employee, you know, put them at ease. They know their performance is dropping because of this issue that they're having. How can we kind of take some of that worry off of them about their performance? And looking at leave options for that employee if they need to take a, you know, a block of time to take care of some of this issue that's going on outside of the workplace. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those. A workplace safety plan, again, there's a collaboration that may need to happen between security, HR, and an employee's supervisor to say, hey, what's going to be, the best way to assist them while they're here in the workplace. So some of the things we may do, changing up the employee's work routine, their phone extension. Again, if they're getting frequent phone calls that work from the harasser, the abuser, then maybe we change their phone extension. Maybe we look at changing their actual work location, where they sit. Their parking could be an issue. If that person knows and predicts when that employee arrives to work and gets to their parking location and when they leave in the evening, should we change up the work schedule if that's going to help so that that person can't be on standby and be able to predict when that employee is going to get to the garage and get from the garage to leave for the workday. Arranging flexible schedules to help with dealing with legal matters. When you take out a restraining order on someone, you have to deal with the courts, you have to deal with attorneys. If that person's trying to leave, they may have to be looking at alternative housing and childcare issues. Do they need to change their children's schools? All of those things take time away from the workplace. So how can we help that employee to deal with that? Can we do a flexible schedule where if they need to be out for a time during the day dealing with that, can they work later into the evening? So these are some of the things that we want to look at to offer assistance to an employee who may be going through any of this. And the second one, I wanted to do that last. Tom is going to talk a little bit more in detail about restraining orders, but one of the things we encourage is if you do take out a protective order against someone who is abusing you, it's a good idea to give security and HR a copy of it. Even a photo may help so that if that person tries to come to the workplace looking for that employee, they may, come in looking real professional and say, hey, I have an appointment with Ms. Jackson at 2 p.m. Unless we know that there's, something going on outside of the workplace, we may think it's just another client, coming to see you. So that's something you may want to think about as well if, a person's ever in that situation. Some of the resources that are on the handouts that Ramona gave you, and we'll publish these after this session as well, but just a few of them to name: the National Domestic Violence Hotline. There's also a Louisiana hotline, the Metropolitan Center for Women and Children, Safe Harbor, and St. Bernard Battered Women's programs. These are just some of the resources that we found in looking at the documentation. Addressing employee performance concerns. If we're a supervisor and we know that an employee is having some performance issues, how can we help them while we know that it's directly related to dealing with an issue like this, that entails domestic violence outside of the workplace. So we encourage supervisors to be sympathetic, empathetic, and understanding. And again, to reiterate, non-judgmental. Again, it is not our role to tell that employee, well, this is what you should do. And we don't put the caveat on it, well, if you don't leave, then I'm going to hold you, accountable for your performance in a harsher manner. We don't juggle the performance issue with, what we feel that employee should do. Because again, we don't know what their situation is and if and when they're able to make a change to that situation. So we want to try to offer assistance as much as we can without judging and without trying to dictate to them, well, this is what you need to do. Otherwise, I'm not going to be understanding, okay? Leave options for employees. We have leaves that fall under sick leave, annual leave, comp time, that some of us earn, and also leave without pay is possible. If we know that there's an issue going on that you need assistance with, again, we can look at flexible work hours if that's going to help that employee to deal with some of the issues that come along with being in an abusive situation. We want to do that, and that's part of our commitment as an employer. That employee may need to take a leave of absence, a block of time. If they're trying to move and they need time to find a place to actually get themselves and possibly children situated into a new place. So that may mean they need 2 weeks, 3 weeks off at a time, or it may be, intermittent time that they need off. We want to be able to, respond to that employee and not hold this issue against them, because any one of us could find ourselves in the same situation at any point in time. Leave without pay, the policy does have a provision as well that if we have an employee that has exhausted all of their leave, their sick leave, their annual leave, they have no comp time, the policy provides for at least a 3-week leave without pay, that employee's job would not be in jeopardy, okay? So that's something as well, and if it needs to be more than that, we can look at it on a case-by-case basis as well, but it does state that we would allow at least a 3-week leave of absence without pay if they don't have any leave, any paid leave. Options and assistance available to employees who find themselves in a domestic abuse situation. Our policy includes handouts that speak to all of us from different perspectives. I may be an employee who myself is in an abusive relationship. I'm a victim of domestic abuse. The policy includes some kind of helpful information from the perspective of being a victim of abuse. Also, if you're a supervisor who's trying to assist one of your employees, the policy gives some good information on how you can, as a good supervisor, how can you assist this employee. And also as a coworker, a lot of times employees won't go to their supervisor, but you and that employee have been coworkers, peers, working side by side for many, many years, and maybe they have confided in you and not a supervisor. So what can you do as a coworker to assist that employee? And so we have some information in the policy from that perspective as well. So from all 3 of these perspectives, what can we do to offer assistance as a coworker, a supervisor, as HR, as security, etc. And a last word of caution for anybody who finds themselves in a perpetrator situation. If you are a person who has been arrested or convicted of crimes that are, related to domestic violence, that could be a real serious issue for here as a court employee. It could actually cost you your job. So you need to be very, very careful that, you seek help if you're in a situation where you have found yourself to be an abuser. We, just want to put that word of caution out there that it could cost you your job. And what we'll do after this session is over is we will email the policy out to all users so that you can save it and have it available to you at any and all times, and we'll also post it in the public drive where we have other forms and policies, and you can pull it up anytime you need it. You may have a family member who can use some of those resources who's going through that issue. So the resources on there would help anybody that would find themselves in this situation. So we'll get that stuff, that information sent out and posted in the public drives after this session. Mr. Tommy?
From the law enforcement perspective, I've had the occasion to respond to incidents of domestic violence in the home that filtered into the workplace or the shopping center parking lot. So for me, first and foremost, our position is straightforward. There's been success, but also tragedy. From a court perspective, for instance, the new applicant seeking employment here, when we do the background check, part of that background check is we do an LPOR registry search. If something does come up in the system, I alert HR, and they take it from there. That's flagged to where they know they have some follow-up. We want to be on the proactive side versus the reactive side of this type of situation. For the tenured employee, it's not much different other than the fact that here we're asking you to be proactive, to work with us, to get us the information to HR, and then from them, they'll get with me. If you don't have a picture, we can get the driver's license picture off the state police database. And the only information I'm going to have is a picture, name, date of birth, and a basic physical description. But in our database up front, when somebody tries to come in, they'll be flagged in the system not to get into this facility. Outside of that, we take it one step further to where we would notify the victim that John or Jane Doe made an attempt to come into this facility and they were not allowed to enter. But then you go to lunch, so we want to make sure we dot all the I's and cross all the T's to where you, the victim, are notified of their attempted entry into our facility. If that requires walking you to your car or doing some of the other things that we do just seasonal, we'll be more than willing to help out in that regard. But the main thing is to silence the violence by speaking out. And we here, I as a law enforcement agent, human resource, from their perspective, LPOR, we have folks that are here to reach out to you if and when you choose to do so. But the main thing is that we be proactive and not reactive in that regard. We're going to look at a 1-minute video here shortly, and then we're going to go into a question and answer session. One of two things. It may be a private question that you may have. We had that in the last session. You can seek out Ms. Veronica or Ms. Ramona Harris after the presentation or email them. Once we get to the question and answer session, please wait till the IT tech comes to you. They'll give you the mic, then you ask the question, and it goes a long way with the audio portion of this presentation.
No more, it's none of my business.
No more, I'm sure they'll work it out.
No more, boys will be boys.
No more, I'll say something next time.
No more, why didn't she tell anyone?
No more, she was flirting with him.
No more, she's too smart to let that happen.
No more, not my problem.
No more, he didn't mean it.
No more, why doesn't she just leave?
No more, he said he was sorry.
No more, she was drunk.
No more, she was asking for it.
No more, she seems just fine to me.
No more, she should have been more careful.
No more, we don't talk about that.
No more bystanding.
No more ignorance.
No more excuses.
No more,
No more.
no more.
Okay, Ms. Ramona?
They're that good. They had answered every question you could possibly think of. Okay?
Well, thank you all.